Welcome everyone to another edition of Play It Through, and on this edition is Vice Project Doom, brought to us by Sammy. Now, similar to Adventures of Bayou Billy, Vice Project Doom combines multiple different styles of play into one game. You have action platforming, you have top-down driving perspective levels similar to Spy Hunter, and then you have first-person perspective shooting levels, like a light gun style of level, but you just can't use a light gun, you're just moving a cursor around. There's also a lot of story and lots of cutscenes, and very few games on the NES had a lot of this. One of the ones that comes to mind is Ninja Gaiden and its sequels. So here we go with Vice Project Doom for the NES. After the opening cutscene, instead of getting a title screen, we just have a push start screen. We then have one last little scene before we get control of the first level, which is a driving level. The driving stages have you firing at enemies, dodging fire from enemies and other things along the hazards of the road, as well as you have to shift your gear. You can shift up to gear 3, in which case you'll go faster, though you can slow down if you like. But usually for the most part, especially in level 1, I want to be going as fast as I can to get through the stage. This is a relatively challenging game. It's one that I've been wanting to do for a long time, but for one reason or another, I just couldn't get the run that I was happy with until now. While driving through this level, you want to make sure you avoid the sides of the road, as bouncing off of them will harm you, though you do have a good amount of health at your disposal. The game slows down a lot when it comes to enemies on screen. It's something typical for NES games with a lot of action, and this one slows down quite a bit here and in other levels, though not as bad as the likes of Astyonics. The first boss here is a truck-like vehicle above us firing a spread shot, as well as firing little vehicles out at us. It's easy to get between the shots of the spread shot and be able to keep firing up at it. Just keep mashing the fire button and you should be able to drain the health. After pretty much every level in the game, you'll have a cutscene or so before we move on to the next part. What's a really awesome touch to the game is after that cutscene and the first level, then you kind of get your title screen where you get to see the name of the game and then jump into the first action level of the game. Your main character in Vice Project Doom has 3 weapons at his disposal, 2 of which have ammo that you have to manage, and the last one is your sword-like weapon, which is mostly what I'll be using in the game. There's a gun that you can use to fire straight shots out, as well as grenades that you can do a lob shot hitting enemies. Though, of course, like I mentioned just a second ago, you do have to watch out for the ammo, which is located in the bottom left of the screen. Of course, there's also the score down there, the time that you have to complete a segment, as well as your health on the right side. There's also a health bar for the bosses that's directly below yours, but of course that is only there when you're in a boss fight, like I'm going to be right here. For the first boss, we're just going to run over to the right side and start slashing at him. You can keep hitting bosses over and over again in this game, which makes some of them very easy. For this boss, he just fires every so often a giant girder at you, which will of course hit you if you're standing directly in front of it, or you can jump in the air in order to avoid it. Either way, just run up and mash the attack button as fast as possible and he'll go down in just a couple of seconds. Now, level number 2 introduces some more enemies, most of which can be defeated in a single hit. You'll notice a couple enemies throughout the entire game take 2 hits, but pretty much it's a lot of running quickly and attacking enemies, which also reminds me a bit of Ninja Gaiden in that fact. The game does have knockback as well, just like Ninja Gaiden, so there's a few things that you can compare it to with that series. On the far right here, we got to jump up to this fence and then over to the ladder on the left there. We're then going to jump straight up over to this platform, though you can take the safer route by, of course, going around the electricity fields to the left up that first wall and then over to the right. But if you time it right, you can easily make that jump. Watch out for some pumpkin guys and drop down the ladder down here, jump over the flame and take out the last guy before we make it to the second boss of the game. Now for this boss, we run up close and duck down directly in front of him when he lands and continue to swipe at him. When he jumps back all the way to the right side, you'll have to jump over him or just try to slash him when he's coming towards you. It depends on how much health you have. Usually if I go into a fight with a lot of health or full health, I'll take more risk than, of course, if I don't have much health going into the fight. When he runs across, he'll go to the far left side and then he'll jump over you and repeat the whole kind of loop once again. But for the most part, as long as you get in front of him and duck down, you'll easily miss his projectile and be able to lay in a lot of hits really fast. The next stage starts off, it's kind of like a TV studio. There's some cameras and the like in the background, but a lot of the enemies are mostly the same, though these green guys that fire out a single large cannon shot out straight are introduced here. You have usually a couple of seconds between their shots to be able to get close enough to them in order to deliver a hit, while you're also watching out for all the jumping dogs and other stuff. Usually, unless enemies really kind of catch up to me or really kind of bunch up, I, for the most part, just keep on running. After that segment, we then get our first of the first-person shooter-esque parts of the game. There's 2 of these, just like there are 2 driving segments, and here you have to move the cursor around and fire at the enemies as they come on screen. For a segment like this, it's relatively easy. There's some health drops as well throughout the course of it. As far as item drops go in the game, there's the drink, which works as a little bit of health replenishment. You have the chickens or turkeys that work as large health replenishment. There's also ammo that drops, as well as coins, which will give you a higher score. There's a couple of types of enemies during this segment. The guys right near the front that will kind of run on screen and then eventually stab you. The green ninjas that run back and forth, eventually jumping into the air and then attacking you from above. And then you have the guys that are just kind of stagnant in the background, which will fire out straight at you if you give them enough time to do so. The next level has a few waterfalls that can block pits, so be careful. Pretty much if you see a waterfall, you're going to want to make a jump instead of trying to run through it that way. There's also the introduction of blocks that you'll have to break using your weapon. The bird enemies are very annoying during the course of this level and throughout the rest of the game. They usually do not stop attacking. They take a couple of times through before eventually I think they give up, but usually by then either I've made it to the next screen or eventually I've accidentally hit them, even when I'm not trying to. Like right there, I was going for somebody else and the bird just happened to walk into my line of fire. Use your sword or whatever it is to kind of take out the blocks here and then climb up here to the top portion, and you have to make a couple of time jumps here. It's a little bit difficult, so you may want to take your time more so than I am there and take out the enemies before attempting to make those jumps, because one wrong jump and you'll end up getting knocked back into the pit. In this segment, you're climbing up the waterfall using logs that are falling down. It's pretty simple to do, but you want to wait a few seconds on a couple of the platforms until you have a kind of pathway with logs to get up. In the next segment, you're going to be running across. There's water that you can go into if there's a solid platform below you, but sometimes there's pits, so you always have to be cautious, as well as there are vines that will hurt you if you run into them, so make sure that you have your weapon ready in order to slice them down, though they do regrow rather quickly, so once you hit them, make sure you're ready to go through. Usually I take care of some other enemies that may be near the vines before I start cutting, that way they don't regrow before I'm able to get through, though sometimes it can be a little bit easier said than done, like right here with so much going on, and I accidentally walk into the vines, but either way eventually I'm able to make it through. Thankfully they only do one thing of damage. Be sure to take out this enemy right near the end here, because he will give you one of the turkeys or meat products so you can refill a lot of your health. Here's one of the largest bosses in the game. You can jump up and attack the little thing at the front of this giant ship in order to damage it. It moves back and forth firing missiles out of the top, which are pretty easy to dodge, but the big weapon, the big gun, is what will actually do a lot more damage to you. When it stops moving, make sure that you're ducking so that you'll be able to avoid the shots. One thing that I haven't mentioned, which is really cool about this game, is you can actually do a duck run, which is something I don't really see in many, if any, other NES titles. If you hold down and right at the same time, or left, depending upon what direction you're facing, you can actually run while doing a slight duck, which will allow you to get under certain enemy fire and allow you to dodge enemy fire or get closer to an enemy that you're trying to hit. Now, of course, if the enemy fire is really low to the ground, you won't be able to duck underneath that, but it's still a really cool feature, and there's only, I think, one time in the game where you have to do it to get by, and that's pretty late in the game. As you can see here, you have kind of like conveyor belts that push and pull you in directions up and down, though you can control yourself on it, just be careful while doing so. In the next area, you have some poison gas that's coming out, as well as some really fast moving blades as you have to maneuver around a few different ladders and the like. There's plenty of enemies going on here. Using your duck run a few times during this segment will definitely help out as far as being able to avoid some of the gunplay from the enemies. At the end here, make sure you hold down while on this so that you can get down, but don't hold it for too long so you don't go into the blades. Then drop down the other ladder and head to the right into the lower right corner. In this room, you just have to go through a couple of the conveyor belts and then drop on down, and now we're on to the next boss. Now this boss is pretty challenging because there's not a whole lot of window to hit him. Basically, he moves back and forth across the room in a diagonal pattern. He'll then shoot a bunch of missiles out, which you can defeat using your weapon. He'll then do a big sweep across the room and go to the opposite side, and then repeat the process repeatedly until eventually you're able to take him out. If you kind of just take him out when he's down at the bottom and plan out your attack strategy appropriately and make sure that you don't gotta go in too suicidal, you shouldn't have too much trouble beating him, but he's one of the tougher bosses in the game. After a pretty lengthy cutscene, we're now on a train that's moving, and as you can see already, the kind of gimmick here is that it will go dark for brief periods of time, not allowing you to see, so you always want to be cautious. Thankfully, the lights out part of it doesn't last for too long before the lights come back on. You'll be able to see where you're about to jump to, but you still have to be a little bit careful when it comes to that whole aspect. Even with the lights going out on you on the train, it's really not that difficult to get through, though I've had a couple of times where I've slipped up and missed a jump and ended up falling down the pits on a couple of the little gaps in the train. At the very end, there's another one of those enemies that will give you meat if you defeat them, so be sure to do so, because the next segment is the sewer segment. Everybody loves sewer levels, right? And this one is no exception to being absolutely amazing, because you're being pushed and pulled by the water, as well as the rats and other animals and things that are in this level are absolutely some of the most obnoxious enemies in the game. Many times did I accidentally get hit by the rats at the wrong moment and ended up getting knocked back, so be careful while going through this. The flying enemies are also particularly annoying. In this segment, you have to work your way up. The water is still going to be pushing you, and there's a few rats, though it's a relatively short segment, thankfully. Right after that, in the next segment, there's a rat waiting for you below, so be careful when dropping down to that platform. Try to get your way through quickly. Even with there are a lot of enemies, there is one that will drop some health, and then we go into the boss fight, which this fight is another one of the ones that's a little bit more annoying to deal with. Similar to the last boss that we just dealt with, where he kind of does a swooping pattern across the screen and then fires out shots. He has two types of fire, a spread shot that he will fire when he's in the air, and a blade-like shot when he is down on the ground. A lot of times I'll wait for him to kind of come back to the side I'm on instead of trying to chase him, as this will give me more opportunity. If you duck down in front of him when he does the blade-like shot, you'll have plenty of chance to hit him on multiple occasions before he ends up floating up into the air. In the next segment, you have electrified floors and ceilings to deal with, as well as a few new enemies, including these big tall things you can only hit in the top portion of them, as well as the guys who throw these giant circle rings, donut-like rings at you that bounce around the room. These guys do take 2 hits, though, to take out. There's also electricity that will kind of come down at you from like these little spiked little conductors, so you have to be careful of those as well while trying to go through. Sometimes the lights will flicker, but they don't go completely out, so you can still see the platforms as you're trying to make it through. Drop down the ladder at the end, being sure to catch it, or just go down it normally. I just like to do things a little bit more quickly. Go on this part, you're going to have some conveyor belts pushing and pulling you. This is pretty standard stuff, but there is that electricity and lots of these circle ball-like enemies to deal with. In the next room, head on through the bottom path and watch out for more electricity and jump up and take this ladder upwards. Continue to the right and drop on down, and once you do so, take out the donut throwing guy and climb all the way down the ladder. Here we have another room with just a couple of guys that are throwing those big circle donut rings. Take those guys both out and then climb down the ladder at the end in order to enter the boss. Now this boss is pretty simple. Be sure to jump to the left and land on the top platform, get underneath of him and just start attacking. Stay a little bit to the left of his head, that way the projectiles he fires out miss you, and just keep swinging. By the time he makes it to the far right of the room, you should have most, if not all, his health already gone. Now, in the next area, you have another introduction. These weird mutant-like creatures. The blue ones will pounce at you and jump around the room, kind of like monkeys or flea men from Castlevania. You have bigger, giant kind of creatures that do similar styles of attacks. And then you also have the ones that stand in place and just spit out projectiles, though these are pretty annoying. They take 2 hits to take out instead of 1 like the blue guys. Just past the segment where you have to actually duck and do the duck run in order to get through, we continue up the ladder on the far right side of the room and make it to the next screen. Pretty short room at the very end. We just head on through the door after avoiding a lot of the enemies, and here you have to jump up through the electricity. Of course, you're going to wait for it to dissipate before you jump on through, and watch out for the donut throwing guys while you do so. Next up, climb up here and you'll see that one of the bricks will break when you're standing on it, and this will allow you to fall down. Now, this is something that pretty much becomes standard fare throughout the rest of the game, especially the very last level where you have a lot of platforms that will slowly start to disintegrate as you're standing on them, so you have to be careful. You also have the return of the vine-like things, but this time they're a purple spaghetti-looking worm mess. But either way, you still have to cut them down and they will respawn and reform a few moments later. Hack your way through all of the purple worm-like mess, and then over here, you have to be careful because you have to wait for a couple of these blocks to disintegrate, but watch out for the Naga-like creature as well. The boss here is a weird, like, snowman slime thing that shoots out some fire and slime that bounces around. My strategy is very simple. Get to the edge of the platforms and just start swinging your weapon at them. You should have no problem being able to get lots of hits in before they're able to move back and forth between the platforms. So just get on one of those, keep hitting, and eventually it'll go down. We're now making our way towards the final level of the game. The first 2 areas before the actual final action stage are the second driving level and the second first-person shooter style of level. Now, this driving segment is a ton harder than the first one. The roads are extremely narrow, and if you run into the sides of the road, you end up taking damage. Thankfully, it's not an instant death, but still, they can add a lot of damage to you pretty quickly. There is some stuff you can still run into that will just slow you up instead of hurting you, but there's also plenty of enemies that keep firing your projectile at. Some enemies come in you at bunches, which are easy to deal with, and other ones will come up from behind, which usually they always end up hitting me, because I usually like to hang out near the bottom of the screen as I find it easier to hit most of the other stuff in front of me. After a while, you'll come to the boss, which is this snake-like creature that moves around. You have to hit just the front of it to do damage, which can be difficult to land those hits. So keep moving around, watching out for multiple different styles of fire. It has like a laser, a spread shot, actually a couple of spread shots that it can do, and you just have to kind of keep maneuvering and firing at the front of the snake thing. Eventually, it will go down, and you'll be able to move on to the next level. For the second of the shooter segments of the game, it's pretty similar, though the enemies are a bit different. It's still pretty much the same thing. You have like a blue guy with a gun instead of the weird ninja guys that were stabbing at you, and now you have red guys instead of green ones, but everything else pretty much remains identical. It's pretty easy. You'll have plenty of health. There's some health pickups amongst the enemies as you're defeating them. You just kind of have to move that cursor around a bit quickly, though sometimes that's easier said than done because of just how slow it ends up moving around the screen. Be sure to pick up the little health bottles when they drop if you do end up needing a little bit of extra health. But it's a pretty short segment overall, and then we'll be moving on to the final level of the game. Now for the final action stage, there's a lot going on with some new types of enemies that will jump around the room, frog-like enemies. You also have the return of the ninjas that pop out of the ground and shoot up, firing out a spread shot before coming back down. So there's a lot going on here. You have also the blocks that disintegrate when you stand on for too long. The first little hallway doesn't have a lot of them, but the second one introduces a whole bunch, especially in a row. So you have to quickly get off of them and keep on moving through. When you make it up here, here is the next segment where you have a bunch of singular disintegrating blocks, making this whole trek to the final boss really tricky. Time your jumps so that you can kind of land safely, usually a second or so, before attempting to make the jumps over to the next platforms. And once you do, it's time for the final boss of the game. You have a really long cutscene before that final boss, but once it starts, you want to do the duck run towards him and start swiping at him. This will allow you to dodge the bullets that he's going to fire out. If you're too close when he lands, he does a sword swipe instead, so stay a little bit away so you cause him to fire his gun, and then as soon as you make sure that that's a bullet fired at you, then do the duck run towards him and keep attacking. We then move on to the second part of the boss. Now the giant thing he turns into is difficult to hit. When he jumps up the first time, land between his legs, and you want to hug the right side here. And then when he does his head motion, you'll be able to hit him a couple of times and then go to the opposite side. This way he'll be able to do both of his head movements downwards, miss you, and then jump into the air. When he does his jump, you'll be able to hit him one time with a grenade if you want to, though that's just to speed things up. I highly recommend the first time you're doing it, just use your blade weapon, and you'll easily be able to get through it as long as you're able to get the timing and placement of your character correctly. Once he's done, you sit back and enjoy the ending to Vice Project Doom. So there you have it, Vice Project Doom for the NES. A really cool and well-made action game. It came out in the early 90s, I think 1991 it was released, and it shows just how great action games could be on the NES. With mixing up the gameplay, had some good music behind it, and just everything about this game is a shining example of what the NES was capable of, and it's kind of a hidden gem. There's not as many people talking about Vice Project Doom all these years later as compared to Ninja Gaiden or some of the other more popular action games. Eventually, you'll see the end screen, and then it will go back to the beginning, and you can start the game all over again. But with that, guys, it's going to wrap up this episode of Play It Through. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider giving it a thumbs up or commenting down below. If you enjoyed this playthrough, be sure to check out the one I just recently did for Godzilla Monster of Monsters, or you can also check out a pretty bad Sega Master System game in Strider 2 that I also recently did. Now, this playthrough was a viewer donated for Play It Through, which is just one of the many things you can get on my Patreon, which of course I have to thank all the members of. You guys keep my channel running and keep it alive with your monthly pledges, so thank you all so much for doing that. If you'd like to help out as well, just click the little Patreon button, and you too could get a Play It Through that you want to see done by me. But anyway, guys, I want to thank you for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.